The night of July 1st, 1694, Philip Christoph von Königsmarck walked into the Leine Palace in Hanover. He was 29 years old, a Swedish count, a cavalry officer with a family reputation for living dangerously. He had received a note summoning him inside. He went, and no one who wasn't already in that palace ever saw him again. Within months, a woman would be legally declared to have abandoned her husband. That woman had never left the building she was already in. She would spend the next 32 years inside a small castle on a heath in Lower Saxony, forbidden from seeing her children, her name banned from the prayers of every church in Hanover. Her husband, having imprisoned her, would become King George I of Great Britain. She wasn't removed because she had an affair. She was removed because she knew what happened in that palace. And the dynasty that needed her silent was about to inherit the British crown. This is the story of Sophia Dorothea of Celle. She was born on September 15, 1666, in the city of Celle, the only child of Duke George William of Brunswick-Luneburg-Celle and his morganatic wife, Eleanor d'Olbreuse, a French Huguenot noblewoman who had arrived at the court of a minor German duchy and become, improbably, its duchess. The word morganatic is a polite way of saying the marriage was quietly embarrassing to the ruling family. George William had previously promised his brothers that he would produce no legitimate heirs, so that the Celle territory would revert to the broader Brunswick-Luneburg family upon his death. Having a daughter complicated that arrangement considerably. So, for the first decade of Sophia Dorothea's life, her own legitimacy was an open legal question. Her father worked steadily to close it. In August 1675, he signed a contract formally acknowledging Eleanor as his lawful wife. A second wedding ceremony followed in April 1676. By April 24, 1676, Eleanor held the court address of Duchess of Brunswick, and Sophia Dorothea was recognized as legitimate. The process took nearly 10 years and required multiple formal instruments. By July 13, 1680, she held the title Princess of Brunswick-Luneburg-Celle. The moment her legitimacy was secured, she stopped being merely the Duke's daughter and became the richest heiress in Germany, W.H. Wilkins's description, and by the financial mathematics of German princely courts, not an exaggeration. The Celle estates were valuable, and upon her father's death, had to go somewhere. Making her legitimate and marriageable was the mechanism by which George William could control where they went. The Hanoverian branch of the family noticed. In 1682, negotiations began in earnest for a marriage between Sophia Dorothea, then 15, turning 16, and her first cousin George Louis of Hanover, then 22. Their mothers were sisters. The proposed union was never about love, chemistry, or compatibility. It was about territory. The marriage would unite the Celle and Hanover branches of the family and keep the Celle inheritance within the Brunswick-Luneburg orbit. To make it happen, Sophia Dorothea's father offered an annual payment of $100,000 to Ernest Augustus and Sophia of Hanover as an incentive for approving the match. Additionally, the marriage contract stipulated that all of Sophia Dorothea's assets would pass directly into George Louis's possession. Her father paid handsomely to place his daughter into a household that would spend the rest of its life looking down on her. The Hanoverian court's disdain for her was established before she arrived. Electress Sophia, her future mother-in-law, looked down on Sophia Dorothea and her, as the family put it, inferior manners. The French Huguenot mother, the morganatic birth, the belated legitimization, all of it was held against her. She entered the marriage carrying the social stigma of having been born inconvenient. And Sophia Dorothea herself didn't want it. When the marriage was announced, she reportedly shouted, sobbed, and smashed a portrait of her fiancé. She was 16 years old, and there was no mechanism in her world for refusing. On November 21st, 1682, the unhappy cousins were married. What followed wasn't a marriage. It was a cohabitation under contract, steadily deteriorating. George Louis maintained a long-term relationship with Erengard Melusine von der Schulenburg, a lady-in-waiting to his own mother. Melusine was publicly established at court. George Louis made no effort to conceal the arrangement. He had 2 daughters with her. He had made his priorities transparent before the ink on his marriage contract was dry. Meanwhile, Sophia Dorothea was isolated in a court that had decided to dislike her, subjected to continuous social contempt from a coterie clustered around the elector and his favorites. Clara Elizabeth von Platen was at the center of that coterie. Von Platen, born January 24, 1648, full title Countess von Platen-Hallermund, was the long-term mistress of Elector Ernest Augustus, George Louis's father. Ernest Augustus met her in Paris, brought her back to Hanover, and arranged her marriage to an accommodating baron named Franz von Platen, who was subsequently promoted to minister. It was an institutional arrangement dressed as a personal one. Franz was a prop. Clara was the power. As historians have noted, she effectively dictated to her husband, who in turn advised the elector, making her influence at court substantial, even if it operated through male intermediaries. Von Platen had been spreading malicious rumors about Sophia Dorothea since the marriage, steadily poisoning the court against the new princess. She had reasons. The younger woman represented a rival center of attention in a court where von Platen's influence depended on having the elector's ear without competition. But there was also a more personal layer, one that would become violently relevant 12 years later. She had a history with Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. Königsmarck was born March 4, 1665, in Brandenburg, into a Swedish noble family with a flair for high-stakes living. His brother Carl Johann had been involved in the 1682 murder of Thomas Thynne in London, a separate incident, an entirely different story, but indicative of the family's tendency toward lethal entanglements. Philip entered Hanoverian service in 1688, holding rank as a major general in the cavalry. He was, by all accounts, charismatic. He had also known Sophia Dorothea since childhood. He had served as a page at the court of Celle when they were both young. They had grown up in the same world, a fact that distinguished their eventual correspondence from a court infatuation. They already had a shared history when their letters began around 1690. Those letters are real. They aren't rumor, not romantic legend, not later invention. The University of Lund in Sweden holds 679 sheets of correspondence between the two, 199 letters from Sophia Dorothea, 480 from Königsmarck. They survived because his sister brought them to Sweden after his death, where they sat in a Swedish academic library for nearly 2 centuries before W. H. Wilkins examined them in 1898 and published the first English transcription in 1900. Lund University scholar Håkan Håkansson has stated that no modern scholar has seriously questioned either the letter's authenticity or the fact of the affair. Dr. Robert Geertz, examining manuscripts at Lund, Berlin, and Hanover across 3 separate archives, found the handwriting in the Lund collection corresponded so closely with documented Hanoverian samples that their authenticity was, he concluded, beyond reasonable doubt. The letters are ciphered in places. The couple used coded language and nicknames for court figures when discussing sensitive matters. Hanoverian authorities decoded them at the time, which is how they became evidence against Sophia Dorothea. By 1693, Countess von Platen had stopped even attempting to repair the broken seals on the couple's correspondence. She was reading it openly, without pretending otherwise. What the letters reveal is a relationship that had deepened over 4 years, from correspondence into something consuming. The couple wrote at least twice weekly, and by the summer of 1694, They had moved from longing to logistics. They were planning to run. The escape route had two documented options: the Duchy of Wolfenbüttel under Duke Anthony Ulrich, or the Electorate of Saxony. Sophia Dorothea's lady-in-waiting, Eleanor von dem Knesebeck, was part of the plan. She would help arrange passage. The Hanoverian court had already sensed the direction things were heading. Sources note that at court, an elopement was much feared. The elopement plan is crucial to understanding everything that followed. The affair itself, a married princess corresponding with a cavalry officer, was scandalous, but containable. An elopement was different. If Sophia Dorothea fled, she would become a free agent, a legitimized princess of Celle, carrying grievances, assets, and knowledge about the Hanoverian court, moving freely across rival German territories. She could speak, she could petition, she could cause damage. That was the threat, not the love letters. The letters were the symptom. The exit plan was the emergency. And then, Clara von Platen created a different kind of emergency entirely. In January 1694, von Platen made a move that history has tended to sanitize as political maneuvering, but was, at its core, personal desperation. She approached Königsmarck and attempted to persuade him to marry her daughter, Sophia Charlotte. He refused. He was in love with someone else. He was 28 years old and had no interest in becoming Clara von Platen's son-in-law. Rejected, she moved within days. She went to Electoral Prince George Louis and told him everything: the affair, the correspondence, the planned escape. The whole Hanoverian court found out. The scandal erupted. This is the detail the standard romantic framing of this story tends to skip. Clara von Platen didn't expose Sophia Dorothea for the sake of the dynasty. She exposed her because Königsmarck had turned down her daughter. The chain of events that would imprison a woman for 32 years, destroy two children's relationship with their mother, and bury a murder. All of it began with wounded pride, not statecraft. But what followed was entirely statecraft. Once George Louis knew, the question was, what to do about Königsmarck? The electoral prince authorized von Platen to handle the situation. The historical record suggests he may have intended expulsion rather than anything more permanent. What von Platen then arranged, for reasons scholars have debated ever since, was considerably more permanent. On the night of July 1st, 1694, Königsmarck received a note. The note, according to one account, was fabricated to look like it came from Sophia Dorothea herself, summoning him to meet her at the Leine Palace. He entered the palace. A confrontation followed. The most authoritative version of events, cited in the Penguin monarch's biography, holds that he was intercepted and killed, his body weighted with stones and thrown into the river Leine. Other accounts place the body beneath palace floorboards, covered in quicklime. Ragnhild Hatton, whose 1978 biography of George I remains the most comprehensive scholarly account of his life and reign, concluded that Königsmarck was murdered, possibly with the connivance of either the electoral prince or his father. Deliberately agnostic about exactly who ordered what, because the documentary record had been systematically destroyed. That destruction is itself evidence. The state archives in Hanover provide, as scholars have noted, scant information about the critical years. Correspondence between Electress Sophia and her niece Elizabeth Charlotte that might have illuminated the events was censored afterward. Hanoverian historian Georg Schnath calculated the original correspondence between Sophia Dorothea and Königsmarck totaled roughly 340 letters from him and 320 from her. Only 679 sheets survive, distributed between Lund and a second archive in Berlin. Approximately one-third of the original correspondence was confiscated and destroyed by Hanoverian authorities. They didn't destroy it because it was irrelevant. The cover-up isn't a theory. It's the math of what's missing. Königsmarck's body was never officially found. 300 years after the murder, in August 2016, construction workers renovating the Leine Palace discovered a skeleton. For a brief moment, it seemed the mystery might be solved. DNA testing subsequently proved the bones came from at least 5 different human skeletons and included animal remains. The palace, it turns out, had other secrets. Königsmarck is still officially missing. Now consider what Sophia Dorothea knew. She had arranged to meet Königsmarck at the palace that night. He walked in. He didn't walk out. She knew who was in that palace. She knew who had just been told about the affair and the escape plan. She didn't need to witness what happened in a corridor to understand what the silence meant. She was imprisoned within weeks of his disappearance, initially confined locally, then formally placed at Ahlden. The speed of that confinement tells you something. The Hanoverians didn't wait for a legal process to begin before restricting her movement. Whatever she knew, or whatever they feared she knew, it was enough to require immediate containment. The legal process came 5 months later, on December 28, 1694. A tribunal of judges and Lutheran church officials dissolved the marriage of George Louis and Sophia Dorothea. The grounds were malicious desertion. Sophia Dorothea, the tribunal declared, had maliciously abandoned her husband. She was 28 years old and had been confined to a castle. Protestant German law permitted divorce on grounds of adultery and malicious desertion. That legal framework existed and was legitimate. What was manipulative was its application here. The law didn't require a wife to have literally walked out of a building. It required a tribunal to declare that she had. And tribunals, in 1694 Hanover, worked for the elector. The inversion is exact. The woman who had been imprisoned was named the deserter. The man who had ordered her confinement was cast as the abandoned party. She maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings. There is no record of whether she had legal advocates. There is no record of whether anyone representing her interests was present in the room. What is recorded is the outcome. She was found guilty, her marriage was dissolved, and she was stripped of every title she held. She was no longer the electoral princess of Hanover. She was, from December 28, 1694 onward, the Duchess of Ahlden. Not a genuine elevation. Ahlden was the village that held the castle that held her. The title was just an address. The place that contained her became the only thing she was permitted to be called. George Louis confiscated all her assets. He allocated her $8,000 annually, later raised to $28,000, split equally with her father, as living expenses for the remainder of her life. He forbade her from remarrying. He forbade her from leaving Ahlden. He forbade her from seeing her children. Her son, Georg August, was 11 years old. Her daughter, Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, was 7. Both children were raised, from that point, by their paternal grandmother, Electress Sophia. Sophia Dorothea of Celle never saw either of them again. She had been born in the wrong position for her own safety and legitimized into a more dangerous one. But there is a dimension to this story that transforms it from dynastic cruelty into calculated political strategy. And it requires understanding what the House of Hanover needed from the English throne. The Act of Settlement was passed by the English Parliament in 1701, 7 years after the murder, 7 years after the imprisonment. Its purpose was to secure a Protestant succession to the English and Irish thrones following the death in 1700 of Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, Queen Anne's only surviving child. The act bypassed over 50 Catholic claimants with genealogically stronger hereditary claims and designated Sophia of Hanover, George Louis's mother, Sophia Dorothea's former mother-in-law, as the Protestant heir. 50 Catholic claimants set aside. The Hanoverians weren't the obvious next in line. They were the acceptable ones. That acceptability wasn't a fixed condition. It required maintenance. It required the House of Hanover to present itself to the English political class as a stable, Protestant, respectable dynasty, suitable to inherit the crown of a nation they had never set foot in. A murdered Swedish count, a scandalous divorce, and a wife imprisoned in a tower wouldn't have been helpful to that presentation. The Hanoverian succession project had been underway since at least the 1689 Glorious Revolution, when the question of the Protestant succession first became acute. For over a decade, the family had been cultivating relationships with English politicians, demonstrating dynastic stability, projecting legitimacy. The 1694 scandal struck at precisely the moment those efforts were bearing fruit. The cover-up didn't need to be complete, it just needed to hold. George Louis arrived in England in August 1714, following Queen Anne's death as King George I. He came without his wife. No one in the British court demanded an explanation. The story of the imprisoned electoral princess had not broken in England while George I was alive. It emerged in fragments over the following century, becoming the subject of serious historical examination only in the 1800s, with Wilkins' biography in 1900 providing the first sustained English-language account drawing on the actual letters. For 13 years, George I sat on the British throne with his wife locked in a small castle in Hanover. Her name was banned from the prayers of every church in his home territories. That wasn't a quiet cruelty. That was a man ensuring that the woman most likely to complicate his position had no public voice, no institutional support, and no access to anyone who might give her one. Ahlden Castle sits on the Lüneburg Heath in Lower Saxony. It wasn't a dungeon. That distinction is worth making clearly, because the horror of Sophia Dorothea's imprisonment isn't best understood through the imagery of chains. She had servants. She had a household. She was permitted to hold a limited court, carry the title of Duchess, attend the local church. Her mother, the Duchess of Celle, was apparently allowed to visit. Her children couldn't. The horror was its scale. Everything reduced, for 32 years, to the boundaries of one small castle and the village immediately around it. No remarriage, no departure, no correspondence with the children she had left behind at 28, who were growing into adults she couldn't know. Her son became King of Great Britain in 1727. She never met his wife. She never saw her grandchildren. She was erased from the arc of her own family's story, while that story became the story of a nation. Reports suggest that as a young man, George II attempted to reach his mother at Ahlden and was blocked by his father. The primary documentation for this story is thin. It surfaces in secondary accounts but lacks firm primary verification, so it belongs in the category of plausible tradition rather than confirmed fact. What is confirmed is that George Louis specifically forbade communication between his son and the prisoner at Ahlden. Whether that ban was ever tested, the result was the same: silence. Her daughter, Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, who married Frederick William I of Prussia in 1706 and became Queen of Prussia, was similarly forbidden from corresponding with her mother. George I's prohibition reached across borders and marriages. The erasure wasn't passive, it was enforced. Sophia Dorothea died at Ahlden on November 13, 1726. She was 60 years old. She had been imprisoned since she was 28. The cause of death was recorded as liver failure. She left behind, according to accounts, a final letter to George I, a letter of protest, written from what she knew to be her deathbed, denouncing what had been done to her. The letter existed. What it said precisely isn't recorded in the sources available. Then came one final act of quiet cruelty. Her body was left in a casket in Ahlden's cellar for months. In May 1727, it was quietly moved to Celle, her childhood home, where it was buried without ceremony. No state funeral, no official acknowledgement. The woman who had entered Hanover as a princess was returned to the place of her birth in secret, at night, handled like something that needed to be disposed of without attracting attention. George I died on June 11, 1727, approximately 7 months after Sophia Dorothea. There is no documented causal connection between the two deaths, and historians don't treat the timing as significant. What is significant is the arithmetic. She was dead before he was. For 32 years, he had outlasted her. The timing of that reversal, whatever it means, is history's. Clara Elizabeth von Platen died on January 30th, 1700, 6 years after the murder, 26 years before Sophia Dorothea would. She died in her bed in Hanover. There was no trial, no exile, no formal consequence. Her influence at court had diminished after 1694. Gossip drove what one source describes as a dagger through her standing. But she lived. She died comfortably in a city she had always moved freely through, having never answered to anyone for what she had set in motion. Von Platen was born in 1648. Her father was a German nobleman. Ernest Augustus met her in Paris, brought her home, and arranged her marriage to a man who would then become her instrument. She spent decades as the informal power behind the elector's decisions, working through her husband's official position while maintaining her own access and influence. She wasn't a passive figure in the Hanoverian machine. She built and wielded her own leverage. Her role in the exposure of the affair was personal, not institutional. She had an affair with Königsmarck herself, at some point before he transferred his attention to the younger princess. When he rejected her daughter in January 1694, she moved against him within days. What she activated when she went to George Louis wasn't a state surveillance apparatus finding a threat. It was a woman who had been scorned, using the political machinery she had access to as a personal weapon. The Austrian ambassador at the time believed Königsmarck was killed on her orders. One contemporary account places her physically present at the killing. Another holds that George Louis authorized only expulsion, and that von Platen made the decision to go further, then had to explain what had happened to an elector who hadn't expected a corpse. The historical record on this specific point, exactly who gave the final order, is irrecoverably murky, because, as scholars have consistently noted, all documents that could have clarified it were confiscated and destroyed by the Hanoverian government. What the record is clear on: von Platen died in her bed in January 1700, when Sophia Dorothea was entering her 6th year of imprisonment. She never stood in a courtroom. She never faced a charge. The patriarchal power structure she had spent her career serving protected her exactly as much as it protected the men she had served within it. Sophia Dorothea outlived her by 26 years. Every one of those years at Ahlden. The history books that were written during and after George I's reign tend to treat the Sophia Dorothea episode as a footnote, a romantic scandal, a marital failure, background detail to the more important business of Hanoverian succession. She doesn't appear on lists of British queens. She doesn't appear in official dynastic accounts. She was, as one modern source puts it, a shadowy figure in the history of the Georgian era. That shadowing wasn't an accident. George Louis demanded that all churches in Hanover never mention her name in prayers again. This wasn't an administrative oversight. It was a specific, affirmative order. Remove her from the spiritual life of the territory she had entered as its princess. Her title as electoral princess was stripped. Her name was expunged from the dynastic narrative. The physical letters she had written, a third of them, by scholarly calculation, were taken and destroyed. The state archives that should have recorded the events of July 1694 record almost nothing. What W. H. Wilkins found when he examined the Lund archive in 1898 was a private cache that had escaped the official destruction precisely because it was private, held in Sweden, beyond Hanoverian reach, preserved by the family of the man who had been killed. The letters survived not because the system allowed them to, but because the geography and the loyalty of a dead man's sister placed them outside the system's reach. The quietness of all of this is worth sitting with, not as a rhetorical device, but as a description of method. Sophia Dorothea wasn't publicly condemned. She wasn't dragged through a spectacular trial. She was declared a deserter by a private tribunal, given a title that was just a place name, installed in a small castle on a heath, and then systematically removed from every register in which she had previously existed. Prayers, official documents, her children's daily lives, the dynastic narrative of the family whose throne she might have complicated. The quietness was the point. Loud removal invites a reaction. Quiet removal makes people wonder if there was ever anything there to remove. 7 years after Sophia Dorothea's imprisonment began, the Act of Settlement made her silence officially necessary in a way it had only been contingently necessary before. In 1701, England needed a Protestant heir, and the Hanoverians were the available option. But they were available only because they were presentable. 50 Catholic claimants with better genealogical claims had to be bypassed to get to Sophia of Hanover. Anything that undermined the Hanoverian claim to respectability, to stability, to Protestant dynastic continuity was a threat to the entire project. A king's imprisoned wife, imprisoned under circumstances that involved a murdered Swedish count and a divorce decree that named the prisoner as the deserter, would have been precisely the kind of ammunition the Catholic claimants and their allies would have used. It was the kind of story that English parliamentarians, who had just fought a civil war and executed a king and expelled another king in living memory, took seriously. The cover-up didn't have to be perfect. The letters at Lund existed. People at the Hanoverian court knew what had happened in the Leine Palace. Rumors circulated in the German courts for years. What the Hanoverians needed was for none of it to become a formal political crisis before the succession was secured, and then, once George I was on the throne, for the story to remain complicated and unverifiable enough that it could never become a clean deposition narrative. It worked. George I died in 1727, still king. His son George II succeeded him and reigned for 33 years. The dynasty's grip on the British throne, purchased partly through Sophia Dorothea's silence, held for a century. Her body spent months in a castle cellar. Here is what the story of Sophia Dorothea isn't, despite the packaging it usually receives. It isn't a love tragedy. The love was real. 679 sheets of correspondence attesting to that, authenticated across 3 national archives. But the love isn't the lesson. The lesson is what happened after the love became inconvenient. The lesson is a woman born into a legal ambiguity, legitimized into a more precarious position, sold via $100,000 annually to a cousin who publicly maintained a mistress while she was expected to maintain the dynasty's respectability. The lesson is that when she sought an exit from that arrangement, through a man she had known since childhood, the exit was used against her. The lesson is that a scorned courtier's personal vengeance was sufficient to trigger a state murder, a show tribunal, and a 3-decade confinement. The lesson is that all the documents that would have clarified what happened in the Leine Palace on the night of July 1st, 1694, were confiscated and destroyed by the government, with the most to lose from their contents. She wasn't the first woman whose dangerous proximity to palace secrets was managed by removal. The specific mechanics varied across courts and centuries, but the structural logic was consistent. When a woman knows something that power needs kept quiet, the problem is the woman. Her departure from the official record isn't a failure of history's attention. It's the intended outcome. Other women at the Hanoverian court watched what happened to Sophia Dorothea. They watched her title stripped and replaced with an address. They watched her children handed to another woman to raise. They watched her name disappear from the prayers. They drew the available conclusions about what knowing too much would cost them. The warning was received. Eleanor von dem Kniesebeck, Sophia Dorothea's lady-in-waiting, who had known about the elopement plan, was arrested after the affair was exposed and imprisoned at Scharsfeld. She eventually escaped or was released. The sources are thin on her fate. But the message her arrest sent to every other woman in proximity to the princess wasn't ambiguous. The Countess von Platen, who had orchestrated the exposure and reportedly participated in its violent conclusion, died in her bed 6 years later. The servant of power was protected by the power she served. The woman who had married into that court at 16, against her will, and tried to leave it at 28, was imprisoned for 32 years and buried without ceremony. That isn't an anomaly. That is the system operating exactly as intended. George I sat on the British throne for 13 years. He arrived in England in August 1714 as the legitimate Protestant monarch of a nation that had bypassed 50 Catholic heirs to reach him. He brought with him Melusine von der Schulenburg, who was widely understood to be his companion and who would later be created Duchess of Kendal by the British Crown. He left behind, in Hanover, a woman who had been imprisoned since 1694 and whose name wasn't to be spoken in his churches. The British public, for the most part, didn't know she existed. There was no announcement, no public acknowledgement, no parliamentary question on record demanding to know where the king's wife was. The cover-up didn't require active suppression in England, because in England there was almost nothing to suppress. The story had never arrived. George I's reign passed, and he died in June 1727, and his son succeeded him, and the Georgian era continued. And somewhere in the historiography, in a footnote, there was a note about a princess of Celle. Wilkins published his biography of Sophia Dorothea in 1900, 174 years after her death, and 206 years after Königsmarck walked into the Leine Palace and didn't walk out. The letters at Lund had been sitting in a Swedish library for the entirety of that interval. The most powerful dynasty in Europe had needed her silent, and silent she had remained, archived in an institution that didn't know what it was sitting on. The full story took 2 centuries to tell. She was removed quietly. That was always the plan. Not spectacle, not martyrdom, not anything that would generate the sympathetic reaction a public execution might have produced. Quiet removal leaves no formal record of injustice. There is no monument to the wrong, no date around which grievance can organize. There is just a woman who was there and then wasn't, and then eventually wasn't mentioned, and then eventually wasn't remembered, and then eventually wasn't real except in a Swedish archive that wasn't looking for her either. Sophia Dorothea of Celle was born on September 15, 1666, the only child of a morganatic union in a minor German duchy. She was legitimized, valued, sold, trapped, confined, and erased. She died on November 13, 1726, at 60 years old, in a castle she had never chosen, having not seen her children in 32 years. Her body sat in a cellar for months before being quietly transferred to her childhood home. Her husband died 7 months later, still king. She wasn't removed for what she did. She was removed for what she knew. And when power makes that calculation, It does not argue. It does not negotiate. It does not wait for a convenient moment. It moves quietly, uses the law as a tool, names its own victim the guilty party, and then removes the victim's name from the record. The warning Sophia Dorothea's fate sent to the women of the Hanoverian court in 1694 was the same warning that institutions have always sent. Proximity to secrets isn't protection. It's a liability. And if you become enough of a liability, you won't be argued with. You will simply disappear. History, until the archive at Lund was opened, let it stand. If you want more stories from the parts of history that power tried to keep quiet, subscribe.